Okay, so welcome to this MMB seminar, and I'm very pleased to have Irene Peano here, who is a social anthropologist at the University of Lisbon, and who's done extensive research on mobilities and migration, focusing a lot on exploitation of migrants, especially in the sex sector, the agricultural sector, but also an activist with a strong interest in forms of resistance to those experiences of exploitation within labour and migration regimes. And I've always found Irene's work incredibly innovative and thought-provoking in terms of how she frames her work theoretically. And so I'm very excited to hear afterlives of the new slavery, modern Marronage, and the multiple afterlives of plantations in contemporary Italy. So thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for the very generous presentation. Thank you all for organizing this and for having me here. It's a great pleasure and honor. What I'm presenting today, as I was mentioning to some of you before, will soon come out as a chapter in the next volume on global plantations in the modern world, and it's going to be your classes if anybody's interested. But it's also part of a book project that I've had for quite some time, looking at the genealogies of contemporary spaces of segregation and containment, but also resistance in the agro-industrial districts of contemporary Italy. So, okay, Gabby just came in. Hi. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay.
Really good. But if we're recording, I should.
Oh yeah, we are recording.
Maybe I could get you to go off screen, or I don't know how to do that. Who knows how to do that?
Maybe he can.
Yeah.
But then how do we make it any bigger?
Oh, but it's fine. Whoever experience sees Irene, not this.
And it will be recorded.
Yeah.
Okay. I hope I've timed the paper all right, and I very much look forward to your comments. I'm going to read just to keep track of time. I hope you don't mind. And of course, I mean, your project on modern Marronage has been great inspiration for this chapter, so your feedback is particularly valuable to me. Okay, so the condition of migrant laborers in the Italian farming sector has received increasing, though erratic, attention in the last 2 decades, both nationally and internationally. Across different fora, it is often glossed in terms of a new form of slavery. Such definition is not the prerogative of the media alone, whether local, national, or international, albeit certainly they employ the image very frequently when dealing with the highly precarious working and living conditions of especially West African farm laborers. Politicians from across the spectrum, as well as international organizations, NGOs, trade unionists, activists, and academics have also relayed these depictions, if with different emphasis. Workers themselves are among the least likely to identify with the label, although this does happen occasionally. These representations may be ascribed to what critical appraisals have dubbed as the new abolitionist discourse in slavery, and of course here I'm referring to Julia's work. Global in sweep, it resurfaced onto the international public arena in the 1990s, concomitantly with growing policy preoccupations with the control of transnational crime and its presumed connections with cross-border migration. Recurrent evocations of slavery and their critiques are always also preoccupations with a past, or rather a multiplicity of pasts, whose weighty but partially disavowed or displaced spectres haunt the present. If, as Julia Connor Davidson reasons, and I quote, modern slavery names not a thing, but a set of claims about what is and what is not morally and critically obscene, end quote, then just what these claims might be, how they are articulated, responded to, or occluded, what in turn they themselves work to occlude, and most importantly, through what deployments of historical narratives deserves further attention in the context of hand. In particular, it is to the spectres of the plantation as the seen and the obscene of modern slavery that I turn, in order of migrant farm labor in Italian agro-industrial districts. Multiple geographically and temporally heterogeneous plantation pasts haunt contemporary agribusiness districts, the slums and labor camps which punctuate them, and their patterns of labor management in different and even contradictory ways. My reflections are based on 10 years, over 10 years, of engaged participatory research among migrant farm workers across several agro-industrial enclaves in Italy. And mostly I'm referring to the Puglia and Tavoliere, so in the northern part of Puglia, the plain of Gioia Tauro in Calabria, and the district surrounding the town of Saluzzo in Piedmont. So we're talking from the far north to the far south of the country. This kind of work is also supplemented by historical, archival, and other secondary material, as well as by interactions with farmers, third sector and state employees, and other actors who have engaged with such representations in different ways. So while contemporary forms of slavery, often labeled as modern or new, have been identified across many economic sectors in Italy, the complex discursive assemblage that coalesced around the notion now invests farming more than any other activity except that of prostitution, which of course is where this whole kind of discourse started in the first place. And in some cases, the two spheres are juxtaposed, as when the plight of female farm workers and the sexual harassment and the violence to which they are subjected is exposed, or when describing the slum-like spaces in which African laborers live, where mostly Nigerian prostitutes also work. In their discourses, different actors have, of course, emphasized different aspects in relation to such images, stemming from a range of positionings, dispositions, assumptions, and intentions. However, slavery is invariably associated with migrants, and most often Black and African laborers, and the patterns of isolated, precarious, camp or slum-like housing, which have been the cipher of their condition in its representation in the last decade. Just what the term of comparison might be, the old slavery against which this new form is pitted, often remains unacknowledged, but several clues point to so-called New World plantations. Clearly, the analogy with transatlantic triangulations is lends particular power when applied to capitalist agriculture and racialized Black or brown workers, reactivating plantation imaginaries that may be triggered by a spectrum of different affective investments, from indignation and repugnance to cruel detachment, manipulation, hypocrisy, or even sheer perverse enjoyments derived from a feeling of omnipotence and the power to subjugate. So let's look at some of these representations. For example, several politicians, including former Minister for Internal Affairs, Matteo Salvini, have related so-called new slavery to undocumented migration. Commenting on the news of 7 speedboats that carried 187 Tunisian citizens landed at Lampedusa harbor on the 15th of September 2018, he confidently declared, and I quote, "We don't feel the need to have new slaves to replace the children we no longer have," end of quote. In the media, images of makeshift boats and dinghies stuffed with black human cargo, sometimes juxtaposed with the plight of African farm workers, implying a direct and even exclusive connection between the chronic, if policy-crafted and yet naturalized migration emergency, so-called, along the central Mediterranean route, with the issue of migrant farm labor exploitation. So, as I said, this concerns mostly West African people in these representations. While the border spectacles of Mediterranean crossings have been seen to evoke the Middle Passage, their association to farm labor under hyper-exploitative conditions works to reinforce the analogy between the historic plantation complex and contemporary agribusiness. Visual artists, and here you have a couple of examples, pictures I myself took in my field sites. This is Foggia in Apulia, in Tavoliere, and this one is from Rosario in Calabria. Visual artists have also produced portraits of disarticulated, reified, and racialized body parts, such as chained black wrists and ankles, for example, that act as metonyms of migrant laborers and symbolize their exploitation in the farms. You can read a small note, slaves, writing up there. The same visual trope, these are just other examples. So the same visual trope is found in countless book and magazine covers and flyers, photographs and posters promoting discussions and analysis on the subject. You can also see in these demonstrations from some of the unions. This is a brand of supposedly ethical pelati made by, again, African farm workers in Apulia. In summoning and even exploiting the specter of extreme forms of alienation, pastoral discipline, and racial terror that have in American plantations the most recognizable, even primal stage, these depictions at the same time, of course, deny working with very subjectivity, reproducing that fungibility that lay at the core of the enslaved condition on historic plantations. In some instances, it is employers' attitudes against workers that have prompted such analogies, as in the case of a farmer in the Pontine area, part of the district of Latina, south of Rome. News of his arrest, which took place in October 2019, reached international media outlets, including British daily The Times, whose correspondent wrote, and I quote, "An Italian farmer has been accused of terrorizing his migrant workers with a shotgun and a knife and forcing them to work in the fields like slaves," end of quote. The reporter quotes sociologist Marco Omizzolo, who has been conducting research among the Indian Sikh workers in the areas, declaring, quote, "It's a new form of the slavery once seen in the American South," end of quote. Another article relating the incident, this time from a local newspaper, describes it as, quote, "an occurrence which seems to come straight out of the 2013 film masterpiece directed by Londoner Stephen McQueen, 12 Years a Slave," end of quote. Farmers themselves, or those in the close circles, have been caught employing the term slaves to describe workers. Such is, for example, the case with one of the 3 men arrested in the district of Foggia in February 2020, following an investigation from which it emerged that dozens of workers from West Africa, Morocco, and Albania were severely exploited and even beaten in 2 large and wealthy farms. In a phone call intercepted by the judiciary and published in the local press, a friend of one of the defendants casually remarks, I quote, "I went by your farm and I saw the slaves working," end of quote. Farmers and gang masters' use of weapons and of other forms of physical violence, as well as verbal abuse and threats, as a means of disciplining workers and more generally asserting authority and inculcating terror, has been witnessed by several African farm laborers whom I encountered in the district of Foggia, and again makes a just analogy with the original scene of capitalist colonial export agriculture. In my experience, migrant farm workers often equate the conditions of dire exploitation, vulnerability, and existential precarity to which they're subjected to a process of animalization, and I've expanded on this elsewhere, clearly identifying the dehumanizing nature of structural racism and thus arguably also evoking, in a sense, American plantation enslavement as a context in which such racism was first and most thoroughly and overtly experimented and elaborated. As anticipated, the new slavery gloss reflects also legal provisions against what is deemed to be the major cause or the instruments of migrant farm workers' subjection, namely illicit labor brokering, known in jargon as caporalato, that literally translates as gang mastership, and that has sort of comes from military jargon, right? So it evokes again a kind of harsh work discipline. New laws punishing such misconduct were introduced into the Italian Criminal Code following a 2-week-long, 400-strong wildcat strike staged by African migrants that took place in the summer of 2011 and was heavily mediatized. The bill turns unlicensed labor intermediation, previously an administrative breach, into criminal offense and was inserted into the section of the penal code that punishes crimes against individual personalities, such as reduction into or maintenance in a condition of slavery or servitude, child pornography, and trafficking, as a subspecies of the crime of duress. Critical legal interpretations have pointed to the fact that the newly established offence did not appear to display any conspicuous qualitative difference from that of enslavement, because both refer to situations of violence, threat, intimidation, deception, or the profiting from conditions of vulnerability, physical or psychic inferiority and need. In general, and given the bill's slippery definition of the nature of the crime, few trials and even fewer sentences have applied it so far. But even before the 2011 reform, in judicial cases, such as that followed the strike in Nardò that I just mentioned, among the charges leveled against the 16 defendants, who included both farmers and brokers, featured also the offences of enslavement and trafficking, once again operating a slippage and an implicit partial equivalence between them and the exploitation of waged farm labour. While initially confirmed by the courts who convicted the defendants to several years prison terms, the appeal trial overturned the ruling on the ground that not enough evidence supported the conviction. In March 2022, the Supreme Court of Appeal in turn overturned the appeal sentence, intimating that the trial should start afresh. To this day, despite some difficulties in elaborating reliable statistics and notwithstanding the extension of liability to employers, based on my interaction with African farm workers and with those accused of unlawful intermediation, it is evident that racialized migrants are generally the most heavily penalized by the law. In the implementation of controls, ostensibly against gang mastership, migrants are routinely stopped at roadside checkpoints, usually at the end of the harvesting season, and may be incarcerated for various unrelated charges, most often for the purchase of stolen vehicles and for driving without the necessary licenses and insurance. Conduct to which they may be forced by a mix of factors from undocumented status to scarce or no literacy and financial constraints, of course. Further, when employers are held accountable alongside migrant labor brokers, the latter, so brokers, are often subjected to heavier precautionary measures, and most commonly to imprisonment itself, sometimes on the grounds of a supposedly higher risk of flight, or of the lack of valid address where to serve house arrest or at which to be reached by law enforcement, because many such defendants live in slums or abandoned buildings, so they don't have a recognized address. Moreover, companies with a clean record in relation to labor offences are automatically exempted from any future check by the labor inspectorate after they voluntarily really adhere to the so-called Quality Farm Labour Network, instituted in 2014 as part of measures to contrast exploitation and illegal brokering in agriculture. And I believe Gabriel might have something to say about all this, as he's doing his PhD on these matters, so it would be interesting to hear his point of view. And finally, the notion of slavery in the legal domain concerns also multinational companies' corporate social responsibility. Princes Ltd, a Liverpool-based subsidiary of the Mitsubishi Group that commercializes processed foods, has since 2011 run the largest tomato processing plant in Europe, located in the industrial complex of Marronage, just outside the city of Foggia. The surrounding flatland, known as Cavaliere, is home in turn to the second most extensive and productive district in Italy for the farming of industrial tomato, and virtually all the peeled canned tomatoes commercialized across the world come from this specific place. Like all UK registered companies with an annual turnover of £36 million or higher, since the approval in 2015 of the Modern Slavery Act, as I'm sure you know, Princes is legally bound to provide a slavery and human trafficking statement for each financial year, listing the steps the organization has taken to ensure that slavery and human trafficking is not taking place in any of its supply chains and in any part of its own business. As it is often the case, to comply with such requirements in its annual statements, the company demonstrates its goodwill by declaring conformity to Global Gap international safety certification standards, which, as several studies have demonstrated, rely entirely on privatized assessment performed mostly through self-administered forms and checklists. UK Daily The Guardian revealed how in 2016 and 2017, Princes had sourced part of its raw produce from a farm in the district of Lecce, just south of Foggia, where in 2015, 47-year-old Sudanese worker Abdullah Mohammed had died of exhaustion on the job. This was the same farm whose owner, among others, from 2013 to March 2022, stood at the bar in the trial that followed the 2011 strike in Marronage that I was talking about before. In the summer of 2016, the Princes plant was blockaded by hundreds of West African and some Bulgarian farm workers who identified in the processing and commercialization giant one of the main players in the industrial tomato supply chain, for which tens of thousands of migrant workers are employed during harvest in the district of Foggia alone. Demonstrators demanded respect of labour agreements with a commitment by companies across the supply chain to contribute to fairer conditions, and they also demanded legal recognition as migrant workers. I mean, the documentation issues is the kind of core one for many of them. They saw in the interruption of the chain itself their most effective weapon. Some Italian lorry drivers supplying the plants with fresh tomato also joined in. Exasperated by the drawn-out, days-long waiting times they are forced to endure outside the factory's premises before they can deliver their freight. Delays, which they attribute to a deliberate strategy on the part of Princes' management to make the tomato dry up under the summer sun and thus reduce its weight and price. In 2020, 3 high-ranking members of Foggia's main criminal cartels were finally sentenced to several years' imprisonment following a judicial inquiry for the extortion of these same lorry drivers, to whom the cartels granted protection while stationed outside the factory in exchange for cash payments. Princes plant workers, whom I was able to intercept between 2015 and 2018, both in the district of Foggia and in their native villages in southwestern Romania, spoke of a fee they were forced to pay to be able to secure the job. Besides its flagged commitments to anti-slavery standards, Princes also established an agreement with Catholic third sector giant Caritas to employ 9 West African migrants within a project titled Work Without Borders, Laboro Senza Frontiere, for which initiative in September 2021, the company was awarded a prize bearing the motto "Fighting Inequality, It's Possible" by transnational human rights NGO Oxfam, and later in June 2022, another prize by the UN's High Commission for Refugees at the presence of Italy's Minister of Labour. While the company can claim compliance with anti-slavery standards and human rights protection, other forms of violence, exploitation, and injustice which fall outside descriptive modern slavery have continued to take place unabated within and around it, for which princes could simply shrug off or ignore accountability, aided by its compliance with corporate social responsibility and fair trade standards that say next to nothing about actual labor conditions. So, in view of their sensationalism, shallowness, and even acts of mystifications, critics point to abolitionist apparatuses' skewed, selective, and racism-blind definition of what would count as slavery and exploitation. New slavery amounts to an exception-making mechanism treating extreme forms of exploitation as the remnants of distant past, which has in the New World plantation its most recognizable, if often implicit, reference. New abolitionist discourse transposes and replicates such distant chronotypes into the present of some backward other place, such as southern Italy in this specific case, especially in its connections with Africa, where equally backward subjects, i.e. southern farmers or migrant gangmasters, are held responsible for the crime of enslavement. The continuities between different forms of labor exploitation and management that are foundational to current global political economic arrangements are thereby eclipsed. Ultimately, new abolitionist ideology and its transposition into law and governance tools do not address the structural root causes of exploitation in global neoliberal capitalism, criminalizing subjects made into passive, infantilized, and objectified others, or adopting cosmetic accountability measures aimed at staving off bad press more than at concrete improvements in labor conditions. Furthermore, these discursive operations rely on a selective and recursive summoning of history that eclipses other potential connections with alternative space-times, in time preventing any reckoning with their durable character into the present. The instrumental nature of discourses on new slavery has egregious antecedents in the past 2 centuries, when the denunciation of practices of enslavement was, of course, expedient in justifying racist and sexist, imperial and extractive projects in the name of a dubious, paternalistic and self-serving humanitarianism, as we all know. In the Italian context, a possible genealogy of this rhetorical strategy can be traced through the 1935 colonial campaign of Mussolini's fascist governments for the conquest of Ethiopia, when the abolition of Abyssinian slavery, as it was called, was employed to justify Italian troops' invasion and very brutal kind of reliance on, for example, the gassing of civilians, through the mobilization of a powerful set of propaganda tools. So this is one of the postcards from the invasion of Ethiopia, and this is one of the books that was sort of documenting so-called Abyssinian slavery. More generally, Italy's colonial endeavor, which began in the late 19th century with alternating fortunes, could rely on the arguments and findings of the Italian Anti-Slavery Society that published this book, established in 1888 under the auspices of Pope Leo XIII. The society was at pains to demonstrate that whatever forms of slavery had existed on Italian soil in previous centuries, they were clearly less abominable than those practiced in the New World. Concomitantly, and incidentally, I mean, slavery existed in Italy into the 19th century. Concomitantly, it sought to push the agenda of Italian imperialism in Eastern Africa by citing the example of freed black slave turned saint Benedict of Palermo, Franciscan monk, known also as Il Moro or the Moor. And this is a depiction of San Benedetto in Palermo today. Allegedly from Ethiopia, which in the 16th century could stand for any African provenance, he was made into an exemplar of how all Christian black Africans had to be freed of their bondage. So, and thus could and should become Italian, yet of course barred from most of the privileges afforded to white citizens. The specter of the American plantation was here a paragon of supreme evil in ways that are not entirely dissipated today and that served to reinforce the colonialist myth of Italiani brava gente, of Italians as good people, of the proletarian, as they called it, and humane form of colonialism, favorably compared to its British and French counterparts. At the same time, the notion of slavery has deeper and equally consequential ramifications in Western political philosophy, and it's something that Julia also addressed in her own book. Several scholars have pointed to the genealogy of discourses against slavery common in European political fora since at least early modernity, as reflections upon political freedom that drew on and reinterpreted classical Greek and Roman thought. These were rallies against tyranny that only applied, of course, to those who were already deemed as free men, and indeed men. In this sense, slavery works as a trope of injustice with high currency even today, regardless of the particular objects to which it is applied. It is thus possible to read in this vein the ramblings of a farmer I met in the plain of Gioia Tauro in Calabria, one of the most important districts for the production of citrus fruit in Italy. And we're talking the southernmost tip of the Italian peninsula, so just before Sicily. A man with a history of emigration to the United States, now in his late 70s, for several years he sought to organize his fellow farmers against the strangling of the sector by what he identified as Masonic powers. His targets were not only politicians, but also the powerful lobbies that work to concentrate land and trade in the hands of a few well-connected actors, misuse public money destined for farmers, and allow for ruthless competition and the consequent depreciation of produce, to the point where many have decided to eradicate the trees that they had so carefully tended for decades in the orchards inherited from their fathers and forefathers. Of course, like most farmers in the area and in the rest of the country, this man also routinely employed migrant day laborers for harvest and other work on his plots at the usual conditions, meaning more or less half the minimum wage, no social security or other benefits. In the presence of one of these workers during a meal, when he systematically ignored the young African man, at the peak of his rhetorical fervor, he exclaimed, "We are the real slaves." This was also the slogan he had printed on the flyers with which he glitters the villages and towns of the citrus district. Like other farmers, he was embittered by what he regarded as the exclusive, obsessive attention reserved by politicians to the issue of caporalato, gang mastership, and the plight of migrant workers, whom many claimed were actually better off than farmers. And the latter, so farmers, at the same time, often justified the breach of labor laws on account of the low prices they received from the sale of their produce, saying so in a way they are forced to pay labor little. Furthermore, other deeper and more complex genealogies can be traced from the current preoccupations with slavery in its past. Historian Stephen Epstein notes how, and I quote, by the fascist period, the rediscovery of medieval slavery and the development of modern thinking about race, anti-slavery and the colonies formed the milieu in which Italians conceived slavery's past, end of quote. The alleged persistence of African blood, quote unquote, in what during the course of the 19th century were progressively identified as Southern Italian races, And this was, of course, the grounds on which Southern Italians were progressively stigmatized. So this idea of African bloods being part of the sort of genetic makeup of Southern Italian populations was based precisely on the understanding that African as well as Arab and Slavic slaves had been bought and sold in great numbers in the ports of Mezzogiorno, southern Italy. Several historians' work further shows how different policies across what is now Italy played a significant role in shaping the European-derived history of slavery in the modern periods and the transatlantic trade itself. Indeed, it was in the context of Genoese and Venetian mercantilism that both the plantation model and the term slave, sclavus in medieval Latin, were forged and diffused, if only partly in the same context. Venetian and Genoese merchant controlled Cyprus, Crete, and then Sicily were the first locations for experiments in capitalist sugar plantations before this moved to southern Spain, Portugal. These are some kind of archaeological diggings and maps of the sites where sugar was made in Sicily. A mixture of slave and nominally free labor was employed in such establishments, with slaves imported from Africa, including the parents of San Benedetto of Palermo that you saw before, as well as from the Middle East and the Balkans. David Bryan Davis further argued that the imbrication of race and enslavability, which characterized the plantation system's ideological apparatus well into the 19th century, originated in the Genoese and Venetian slave trade between the 11th and 15th centuries, especially along the Dalmatian coast, hence the term Slavus, of course, from Slavic. And this trade, Davis argues, foreshadows, and I quote, almost every aspect of the soon-to-appear slave trade, end quote. The tendency to justify slavery in terms of innate characteristics and dispositions, the emergence then of a relation between skin color, other bodily and genealogical features, and enslavement was already identifiable in the Mediterranean trades during the Middle Ages and the early modern periods, first among the Arabs and then in the Italian context, where slaves are called by terms such as Turks, Moors, or Negroes. Besides plantations, slaves in Italy were employed in high numbers as domestic servants and, above all, as rowers in the Genoese galleys. Just as for New World plantations, a literally carceral regime of racialized slave discipline was implemented through slavery in many contexts in the Mediterranean. Overall, according to the official records, almost a third of migrant workers in Italy today are EU citizens, getting to more than a third when European countries that do not belong to the EU are factored in. And Romanians are the most represented nationality in absolute terms. Among them, a significant proportion of those I met, especially in the district of Foggia, identifies Roma or Gypsy themselves. And yet, the association of European workers' own plight with slavery is, of course, less common. The same holds for Moroccans, who are actually quite a lot in percentage. They are second in absolute terms. Albanians, who are fourth, and Tunisians, sixth. Another instance in which more localized genealogies of enslavement that featured, in fact, Slavs, Tartars, and Moors are covered over. At the same time, current regimes of migration governance, a key aspect, of course, of the institutional racism pressing such subjects and fostering forms of hyper-exploitation and vulnerability, have also been seen as emerging from the rise and then the breakdown of the transatlantic system of racial slavery. And they were, of course, needed to create new mechanisms for the control of labor mobility. The introduction of coolie, so-called indentured labor, and the concomitant adoption of the passport on a larger scale after it was initially envisaged to control slaves' movements in the North American plantation system are often cited as key mechanisms in this process. And yet, even in this case, Mediterranean antecedents can be dug to the surface. Prohibitions against transporting slaves without owners with written permissions and against slaves leaving the city of Genoa without proper papers were in place as early as 1300s. This is Exton again, when Genoa had a pass system for slaves outside the city and suburbs. Finally, what is depicted as contemporary Italian farmers' adherence to New World planters' ethos and comportments might as well be genealogically traced to more localized histories of farm labor discipline in 19th and early 20th century larger states, where landowners, stewards, overseers, and rent collectors were regularly armed. Indeed, labor discipline in the capitalist farm states of early 20th century Tavoliere, for example, has been defined as nothing short of carceral. People were even muzzled so that they couldn't eat what they were harvesting in the early 20th century. As noted, references to military-like labor discipline have survived in the now proliferating term caporalato, that again refers to gang mastership and was adopted in different parts of Italy at least since the 19th century. So not only are instrumental forms of abolitionism and humanitarianism, as well as selective race and class blind ponderings of the idea of enslavement, integral to modern European thought and its colonial offshoots, as well, they are also clearly identifiable in the Italian context. The casual evocation of the transatlantic trade and the New World plantation as the scene against and in relation to which the contemporary new or modern slavery is pitted occlude other genealogies and trajectories. Different people, including Monique Alibert and Sophie Moore, coined, in particular, they have coined a notion of the plantation obscene to foreground such spectacles rarefying effects. Against these erasures, they urge for the development of critical methods that attend to the ways of knowing and living that produce outsides to the plantation. And of course, other authors and you in your projects have proposed to counter neo-abolitionist dogmas by paying attention to practices of modern Marronage in relation to histories of fugitivity, thereby foregrounding rather than eclipsing the crucial role that dispositives of mobility control play in fostering extractive operations, but also acknowledging the subjectivity of those who are their targets. More than in enslavement, the echoes of the New World plantation today may materialize in the desires of migrants for escape. Some scholars have located such emerging practices of knowledge production, resistance, and flight within what they conceptualize as the Black Mediterranean. And I'm thinking of the work of people like Camilla Hawthorne, for example, that they draw on kind of much earlier works as well. So I seek to take up such insights and intuitions, weaving them together to trace alternative genealogies in the margins and in the wake of plantations past. So just briefly, sorry, I don't want to talk too much. So transatlantic history and its Euro-Mediterranean antecedents can certainly play parts in understanding not only current regimes of racialized violence and exploitation in Italy, but also idioms of resistance to them that may also employ the notion of slavery in oppositional terms. So, for example, I have frequently heard West African migrants complain about their fellow farm workers and slum dwellers, saying they have a slave mentality, meaning they accept oppressive conditions. Others, commenting on their predicaments in Europe, also remark how slavery never finished, they just modernized it, by making people pay for their own journeys, for example. When talking about their origins, Gambian migrants are especially proud of the iconic figure of national or nationalized, semi-fictional enslaved hero, and sometimes they recall how the first known European to sail up the Gambia River was in fact Venetian explorer and slave trader Alvise Cadamosto. So this is from the WhatsApp profile of some farm worker. The self-assigned toponyms of the shanty towns where West African migrants live, when you have up there, I mean, this is now much, much bigger. It's sprawled, so everywhere, like, I mean, all these empty spaces are full by now. This is an old picture, in fact. But so the toponyms of many of the shanty towns where West African migrants live and from which many are recruited for farm labor are also significant in this respect. Many are known as ghettos, a term drawn from Jamaican English by its Ghanaian assimilation, according to my interlocutors, indicating a space on the margins or outside the law where alcohol, drugs, and sexual services may be purchased in dedicated joints or connection houses. Yet the term also exceeds Black Atlantic imaginaries and their Afro-Mediterranean readaptations. While it clearly bears North American Black geographical reference as well, dating back, of course, to the early 20th century, the genealogies of ghetto lead once more all the way back to 14th century Venice, where the original Jewish ghetto or ghetto was established, again summoning the mostly eclipsed Mediterranean prehistories of modern racialized containment. Besides acting as recruitment hubs and devices of spatial segregation, these slums are also knots along migratory routes that originates on the southern end of the Sahara Desert and extend along tortuous and ever-changing trajectories to the far northern shores of continental Europe, what Harney and Moten would call undercommons, spaces of Black fugitivity. Black Atlantic, Caribbean, and North American connections also manifest in references to some or other version of Rastafarianism. This is from a shack that was built in this slum. Now these drawings are no longer visible because, of course, these constructions and spaces change very quickly. And references also more generally to Jamaican culture linked to the awareness of living in Babylon, or in the scathingly and bitterly ironic nicknames, some such ghettos or squatted buildings are given, for example, Washington, the White House, Guantanamo, or Mexico. This is actually Mexico. And I'll come back to this in a minute. So appeals to Rastafarianism interestingly produce a reverse narrative to those discourses in which Ethiopian and thus by extension today African forms of enslavement justified colonization, cloaked in the rhetoric of humanitarianism and civilization. Rastafari Makonnen, Emperor Haile Selassie, Rastafarianism's Messiah, had been depicted by fascist imperial propaganda as a megalomaniac and despotic leader who tolerated the endurance of slavery in Ethiopia, ignoring his efforts to eradicate it. Even the Chicana and Latina experience surfaces in this constellation of images. The now largest African farm worker shanty town in the district of Foggia is known by its inhabitants, or at least by the older ones, as Mexico, by virtue of having been cut off from the asylum seeker reception center, which its initial nucleus was a part. So the idea of we didn't cross the border crossed us, echoes other occlusions in a truly global time of plantation afterlives. Finally, even when workers do make recourse to the language of slavery, they might evoke alternative genealogies to those of the American plantation, and only to detach themselves from them. During a field trip, I undertook to Sliven, which is a Bulgarian.
What is
Are you for an MMB and then PPF seminar?
Yeah.
Afterlives?
Let me just do my full start history.
I took a field trip to Sliven some years ago. And Sliven is the Bulgarian city with the largest Roma population in the country, and this is where most of the Bulgarian workers, farm workers, come from, who are employed in Italy, and especially in the district of Foggia as well as in other parts. And I and my sort of fellow travelers came across an elderly man strolling down the streets. Who immediately inquired about the reason for the presence of our presence there. So when he learned that we were interested in talking to people about the conditions of life and labor of migrant workers from the town in Italy, the man invited us to his house, enlisting also his brother to support the story. He'd been employed for several years as a daily farm laborer in Calabria, he explained. In excited and emphatic speech, when wishing us goodbye, after an engaged conversation over tea and sweets, he recommended, and I quote, "Go and tell your leaders that the Roma are not slaves." And he obviously referred to the centuries-long and much forgotten bondage of their ancestors, of Roma enslavement. So contemporary racial and labor politics in Italy certainly developed in dialogue with and were influenced by what occurred across the Atlantic and with reference to imperial projects. And yet, local specificities, and their durabilities, to borrow Ansel's concept, also matter, as do the reverse movements whereby practices and ideologies of enslavement and early experiments with the plantation mode of production traveled from the Mediterranean to the New World in the early modern period. The history of the transatlantic trade and the New World plantation doubtlessly have a prominent spectral presence, evoked not only by selective references to slavery, but also through images of boats stuffed with black human cargo, by portraying these articulated, objectified, and racialized body parts, and in the coinage of the notion of a black Mediterranean as a redemptive parallel to black Atlantic. And yet, as I hope I showed here, the tracing of alternative genealogies and the identification of recursive patterns to which the histories of plantations in slavery are wielded for instrumental purposes are irrenounceable tools for truly abolitionist struggles. Thank you very much.
I'm wondering if we want to
Yes, it started at 1.
yeah, sure. Oh, sad, I can't make it turn off. Stop recording.
Okay, yeah.
I don't want to hang up. I just want.
Yes.